Okay, as for aesthetics, in the previous podcast, this gap between the frame and my head was too large, and there will be some complaints, but let's ignore that and think about what we need to do to save the world and what India wants to do. So, we were talking about power generation and reliance on fossil fuels, industrial sector, transportation, and so on. Let's look a bit more at the numbers. India's carbon emissions reductions from fuel consumption, net zero scenario versus no transition scenario, business as usual as they call it. So you can see the numbers are already much larger compared to what we had before. Oops, I'm going back. Oops, here. 4 gigaton CO2 was the scale. Now we are jumped to 8 gigaton CO2, and we are hitting over 7 here for business as usual, and that's going from 2000 to 2050. And as usual, it is again about various things like net zero scenario has to go here, this black area, and coal is in it, that has to go. If you make no transitions, obviously you go into la la land, which is going to be very irresponsible. But this obviously will depend on what else is happening in terms of technology availability and India's energy independence, plus what the others are doing. You know, the rich people who have been emitting since the Industrial Revolution, they have to lead by example and also transfer technologies. So you have other various things: coal, gas, oil, carbon capture, bioenergy, hydrogen, electrification of things, efficiency, recycling, clean power, fuel switching, and of course carbon removals. What does the note say? The no transition scenario is a hypothetical counterfactual that represents a world in which no further actions are taken in the power and road transport sector to reduce carbon emissions, keeping the current fuel mix constant at the 2021 levels and growing proportionally under the same economic transition scenario demand forecast for energy demand. In industries, most sectors continue to use the same fuel mix through 2050 in the no transition scenario, but obviously it is unrealistic in the sense, no matter what, just the health considerations and impacts on crops and food production and water and so on, rainfall extremes, temperature extremes, is going to force countries to do something. It's a question of how far down will you come down from this no emission scenario. So this is worse than the worst case scenario, okay, honestly. So let's add hydrogen and investments to this discussion that should have gone probably here, but nonetheless, hydrogen, domestic demand for hydrogen increases to 53 million tons H2 by 2050 under the net zero, about a tenfold increase from today. New demand for hydrogen is driven by rapid adoption of hydrogen-fired direct reduction furnaces in steel industry, taking the demand to 33 million tons H2 in 2050. Other significant sectors include 7 million tons for energy industry's own use, 5 million tons for power production as a critical backup. In transport, some 3 million tons of H2 is used either in its pure form or as a derivative fuel such as methanol or ammonia to propel aircraft and vessels over medium to long distances. Today, most of the hydrogen in India is produced from unabated fossil fuels, so it's not green or blue hydrogen. There's a spectrum of hydrogen based on how you produce it, so you have to be careful. By 2050, hydrogen produced with flexible grid connected electrolyzers powered predominantly by renewables becomes the dominant pathway in India under the net zero. There is no option, you have to do that. What about investments? To reach net zero emissions by mid-century, a total of $12.7 trillion must be invested in India's energy system on the demand and supply side, representing an average of $433 billion per year. The increasing adoption of electrification in industrial processes, EVs and electrolyzers for hydrogen production requires a commensurate expansion of India's power grid. Under the NZS, around $2.1 trillion of investment flows toward the grid in India, doubling the length of the network to over 20 million kilometers from 2022 to 2050. There are obviously multiple factors. Commitments to global, mitigation is one thing, but India's own economic development, energy independence, and raising standards of living, including air quality, water quality, food availability, and so on, are going to be critical. So a lot of this investment will be driven by internal needs and not really based on global pressures as such. Okay, so let's move to policy considerations. Our net zero scenario and economic transition scenario lead to very different outcomes for India's energy transition and by extension for the global climate crisis. That's the key. Net zero scenario, by limiting global warming to 1.77 degrees C, meets the headline goal of the Paris Agreement of staying under 2 degrees C, while the economic transition scenario breaches it by leading to 2.6 degrees C warming by 2100, but you have to always be careful about scenarios and what the probabilities are. To bend the curve toward net zero scenario and toward global net zero by 2050, we identify 5 key policy action areas that should be addressed in the immediate future. There is little time to waste, as the transition must accelerate immediately, and the ETS and NZS trajectories start to diverge as soon as 2023. Actually, I'm recording this in 2024 July. It's already mid-year, so I don't have the data on how the two scenarios are looking. My guess is, considering the actions on NZS, economic transition scenarios still dominate, so they must be already diverging anyways, as stated here. Scale up the grid investments to enable a renewables heavy power system. That's not happened yet as far as I know. Electricity network operators face challenges from the rapid expansion of variable renewables on the supply side and evolving demand in the form of air conditioning, electric vehicles, and production of green hydrogen. Therefore, higher grid investments are needed to prepare India for a net zero power system that relies heavily on renewables. So changing the grid system or improving it or making it smarter and so on are future investments that need to be budgeted and included in fiscal policies. So you have to follow up to see if that's happening and whether it's happening fast enough. Under NZS, India will need 2.1 trillion of grid investment over 2022 to 2050, of which 1.2 trillion is spent to sustain the existing grid and replace existing assets, and 897 billion to expand the grid for new electricity consumption. How people get their renewables needs grid design as well. In the NZS, the length of the grid doubles to over 20 million kilometers between 2022 and 2050. Over 43% of total grid investments are needed for long distance transmission of power, and the remainder of the distribution segment that supplies electricity to end users. So grid to grid versus grid to users. The government needs to consider reforms to enable more grid investments, particularly from the private sector. So grid needs $2.1 trillion of investment to support the power sector. So utility scale renewables will have a local grid, and they need to feed the grid that is a combination of everything else, fossil fuels and so on. So because the distribution of renewables is going to be complicated based on availability of solar and wind and hydro and nuclear and so on, right? Second one, in terms of policy considerations, scale up investments in renewables. An average annual investment of $90 billion is needed until 2050 for building low carbon power capacity. Power capacity has to be low carbon in the NZS. India's domestic bank alone may not be able to match the scale of speed required to meet financing requirements under the NZS. India's cumulative investments in expanding the power generation capacity reaches 2.8 trillion by 2050 under the NZS, of which 2.7 trillion is spent on low carbon sources. This translates to energy of more than $90 billion of investments annually. Financing for fossil fuel energy supply falls by 55% in NZS compared to ETS. So you are offsetting investments in NZS to move them to offsetting from ETS to NZS, right? Therefore, India needs to tap into all sources of financing. Most Indian power producers rely on commercial loans and some recourse-based debt for the building projects, and green bonds are increasingly being used to refinance operating projects. 8 of the global top 10 pension funds and sovereign wealth funds are yet to invest in India's renewable sector. So a lot of the retirement funds, people don't know exactly where it goes, and the managers of those funds are getting more green, so-called impact funds, and they would be looking for investments that are good for the world as well. But then you have to be making money as well, so you will look for investments that are reliable in terms of returns. Investments by India's pension and life insurance funds are strictly regulated, and the institutions are not allowed to invest in renewables. So even internal funds are not necessarily flowing into it. Therefore, the government needs to issue favorable policies, and international investors should explore more thoroughly the opportunities for transition investment in India. Okay, so these things cannot be forced, right? So grid length by scenario in millions of kilometers. For ETS it's lower because you're not transitioning, you're not keeping NZS in mind, you're keeping economic development in mind, but NZS needs more grid length, and India's grid investment by driver net zero scenarios. So you have asset replacements, system reinforcement and new connections, and you have economic transition, which is got overlaid on this, so you can see how they play out together in terms of investments in basically billions of dollars. Okay, so let's come back and continue this, because I'm already 12 minutes. That's a good length for a podcast. Plus I'm expecting a cable operator to come in any minute, and if you're in the US, you probably hear lots of stories, nightmare stories and funny shows about waiting for the cable guy. There's a movie called Cable Guy, Seinfeld, if you know that show. They did a show on Cable Guy and Kramer playing games with the cable guy and driving him crazy and so on. So let's leave this here and come back and discuss more on policy options. Okay.